Welcome to part 3 of cycle 3. We have started in our first two videos by making the case of connecting teaching to assessment, then looked at how to develop a full performance assessment, and then in this video we will look at a very special model called the Integrated Performance Assessment Model, also known as IPA in the language world. But before we start, I do have a little warning for you. If you are still new to performance assessments, if maybe you've never done one of those or only tried one or two, you may want to skip this video. This is a little, I don't want to say harder, but it's a concept that requires some practice and some experience with using performance assessment. However, if you are one of those teachers who has been implementing performance assessment, this is the perfect video for you because I think you'll be ready for doing IPAs. So that's my little warning just up front, because everybody's in a different place in their understanding of performance assessment. This is not required. This is more of an ideal world kind of thing, and you'll see why. So in the last video, we looked at the idea of performance assessment, and we talked about the structure of them, how to develop them, the different elements. But because this year we have focused only on listening and speaking, all the examples I showed you were really focused on the speaking of the language. Of course, performance assessments can come in all of the different modes, not just in speaking. And so today we're going to integrate multiple modes, and we're going to talk about how that looks and what the implications are for that. So imagine you're using performance assessments. You've developed a fantastic performance assessment and you want to use it in your class, but are you using that assessment truly for learning? We're seeing lots of districts around the country implementing performance assessment now, but I'm beginning to get the feeling that we're just replacing our end of chapter tests with those performance assessments, which is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But often they're still viewed as evaluation by the students. So how can we make that switch of using assessments not just as evaluation, but really as feedback for the learner? And how can we make that assessment not just as an assessment, but truly as an assessment for learning? Those are the questions that we'll be trying to answer today as we're looking at this integrated performance assessment model. So, as we're trying to go from a end of unit assessment that is really taking often an evaluative stand to more of an integrated model, we're going to be reviewing, or we're going to be looking at the different modes. And I know all of you probably know the modes of communication, but just to make sure that we are in the same stage, because this is going to be key to understanding IPAs. We have to really understand the modes backwards and front, because they're going to be, as the word says, integrated into our assessment model. So let's just quickly review. Interpretive mode, of course, is where learners understand, interpret, and analyze what is heard, read, or viewed on a variety of topics. In the interpersonal mode, learners interact and negotiate meaning, very important, negotiate meaning in spoken or written conversations to share information, reactions, feelings, and opinions. And of course, in the presentational mode, learners present information, concepts, and ideas to inform, explain, persuade, narrate on a variety of topics. And if you've been to one of my workshops before, you also know the different hand motions that go along with the different modes, coming from Yo Azama, Japanese teacher out of California, interpretive, interpersonal, presentational. But if I had to ask you, could you rank order the different modes? Could you order the modes in a way that students develop confidence in first? What would you say comes first? Interpersonal, interpretive, presentational. Is there a logical order, and how can you take advantage of that order in assessment? That's kind of the idea behind the IPA model. So let's talk about how we develop an IPA. It's actually pretty simple. It's an idea where we can integrate all three modes in a logical sequence. So we start with the interpretive mode. and whatever student's doing there will then lead to some kind of interpersonal task, which then leads to a presentational task. And it becomes through this circular thing because students receive feedback at every stage of the game. So in the interpretive mode, we ask the students to react to, deal with, respond to some kind of authentic resource. Could be a listening, could be a reading. We're going to focus on listening, obviously, for this year. In the interpersonal mode, students have some kind of task about that resource, maybe that specific resource or a resource about a similar topic that was discussed in the resource, but something it had to do about that particular topic. And then in the presentational mode, the students talk about the findings. You can see now at every stage, students get feedback. So after students have dealt with that authentic resource, they receive feedback in order to be prepared for the interpersonal task, for which they receive feedback in order to be ready for the presentational task, which of course means they get feedback again to start probably a new theme, a new topic in the interpretive mode. Now I've added here some suggestive guideline. They're not set in stone, but let's say you have a 6 to 8 week unit. Instead of having all the assessments at the end of that unit, those assessments happen at different part, and probably the more logical part of the language development process. We know that students acquire language first in listening and likely also in reading. So that interpretive assessment, instead of happening at the end of the unit, happens rather soon, in the first couple of weeks of a 6 to 8 week unit. Student then receive that feedback to use maybe about halfway, closer to the end of the halfway point of the unit to have or to complete that interpersonal task. And after receiving feedback on that, at the end of the unit, they'll be ready for that presentation task. So instead of having those assessments at the end all at once, these assessments have been truly integrated throughout the unit at the most logical stage of language development, to provide students not just the opportunity to perform and be evaluated, but really to provide students the opportunity to perform and receive feedback. We know this is incredibly valuable because if students can't say or write anything, it's likely because they don't understand the words. So starting with the interpretive assessment, allowing students to develop that ownership in the language and receiving that important feedback will likely prepare them much better for the interpersonal task, during which they can negotiate meaning, come to better understanding, and that will prepare them to truly be ready for a presentational task at the end of the unit. I just love it because it really acknowledges where students are in the learning process, within each unit. So let's take a look at what that could look like as an example. Take the idea of the healthy plate as the thematic unit. Happens a lot. And here we have a scenario, just like we would in a regular performance assessment, although it's a bigger scenario because it tries to encompass all 3 modes. So the scenario happens to be, after observing the unhealthy food habits of you and your fellow students, you decide to make some changes in your eating habits. You decide to research whatever target language schools and analyze the differences in American and target language school cafeterias. You evaluate your current eating habits, and then you examine food guidelines from various countries. You decide to create a personalized food and exercise guide and a healthy menu for a week based on your personalized food and exercise choices. So certainly this is an IPA model that can happen at level 1 or level 2 in the beginning stages of language development. So what would that look like then? We would start with the interpretive mode, of course, where students view a series of videos describing school cafeterias. So this is a listening task, and students will get the input. It allows us to check for understanding, to see if they have actually developed ownership in the vocabulary, the language structures, and the chunks that they need in order to complete later tasks. They will receive feedback on that, and then complete the interpersonal task, which could be in this case, where students discuss their findings, the findings from the videos that they watch, comparing and contrasting their own food and their exercise habits. So you can see how the interpersonal task is directly connected to what they have done in the interpretive task. But the difference is we know that students will be ready for this interpersonal task because they have already received feedback on the interpretive task. So it's not happening 3 days back to back to back, like, oh my goodness, all my students failed the interpretive assessment, and now they won't be ready for interpersonal. Not only have we had time, but connecting the theme across all 3 assessments allows them to develop their language skills, develop ownership, and be ready for the next one. So having done that interpersonal task, we then move to the presentational task, which could be students create and present a personalized food and exercise plan and explain their choices. So again, because they have done the interpersonal task where they talked with a partner, talked with a friend, or in a small group, where they discussed what they found out in the interpretive, they are now ready to create that presentation. So you can see how those 3 things really are truly integrated and connect well with each other. Truly a model of performance assessment. Just going to have you take a look at this one more time, and I hope you can see how all 3 connect, both in thematic approach, but also in language development. Okay, before we finish though, I'm going to give you some advice about developing IPAs, because while it is indeed, yes, a beautiful model, there's a couple of things I would like you to consider. It is a beautiful model, it is ideal, but it is not for every single unit. As teachers become more comfortable with performance assessment, we're seeing some teachers developing these IPAs for every single unit. And while I would expect there to be some kind of interpretive assessment in every single unit, not every unit lends itself to have both presentational and interpersonal tasks. It just depends on the theme, it depends on the different topics you're trying to address. So don't try to force an IPA just because you have to. Of course, we know that units that are focused on content rather than language really lend themselves well to IPA because it gives us something to talk about. It gives us something to listen for, something to talk about, and something to present. So if your units are focused on content rather than language, IPAs are very, very easy to develop. There's some discussion in the field, and while the original model implies that the interpersonal happens before the presentational, I know that some educators are now also advocating that you could switch those two, that after having the interpretive mode, the interpretive task where the students interact with some kind of authentic resource, they then present on their findings and then have a conversation about it. I could see value actually in both models. And last advice, and probably the most important one, an IPA is not something that you want to try right away. You really want to become comfortable with performance assessments first, hence the warning at the beginning of the video. However, having worked with a variety of groups of teachers, you will notice the more and more you're doing performance assessment, the more likely you will want to do integrated performance assessment. It just seems natural. So if you do them just in separate, as separate modes, and maybe at the end of the unit, you'll really quickly get to the point where, like, well, wouldn't it be nice if they could be connected? Every group of teachers that I've worked with on assessments has gotten to that point. It takes a couple of years of implementing performance assessments, but I promise you, you will get to that point. If you're comfortable with performance assessments, you will want to do IPAs as well. It is a great model, and it really is kind of like the Cadillac of world language assessment. That brings us to the close for this third video of Cycle 3, Integrated Performance Assessments. I hope you'll take advantage of the many resources that are on the website. I've shared banks of performance assessments, models of integrated performance assessments, a feedback form for your performance assessment to see if they actually follow some of the different parts that we discussed in video 2, and several other resources to extend your learning.